Welcome to our Gaza lecture series. It's a huge honor to have Ken Roth with us today, the former executive director of Human Rights Watch and the author of a new book, Righting Wrongs, 3 Decades on the Front Lines, Battling Abusive Governments, on sale here behind me. Ken will stick around to sign some of those books after this event. Ken will be speaking about Trump's mass expulsion plan for Gaza and U.S. sanctions on the International Criminal Court. This will be followed by a conversation between he and I, and then an open forum with the audience. I'm going to give Ken a proper introduction in a moment, but we have a free speech policy here that we have to read out before all of our events to make sure we are in good legal standing. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Jonathan to read out that statement.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the maximum exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that audience members may not share the same views as the speaker, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event will respect the right of the speaker and the organizing department to share their perspectives and ideas and not cause a disruption to the event's activities. At the end of the event, there will be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions. Please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question. In the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and ask only one question. Thank you.
Thanks. So I've introduced many speakers over the years, but today's introduction is one that I've looked forward to the most. Ken Roth has been accurately described by the Committee to Protect Journalists as the godfather of the human rights movement. Roth began his human rights career as a volunteer, working on nights and weekends while serving as an attorney and a federal prosecutor. He joined Human Rights Watch in 1987 as deputy director. In 1993, he was appointed as executive director, where he led this organization for almost 30 years. Under Roth's leadership, Human Rights Watch expanded into the leading and most influential human rights organization on the planet. Human Rights Watch grew from a staff of about 60 people and a budget of $7 million to an organization with 552 employees covering more than 100 countries and a nearly $100 million budget. In 1997, Human Rights Watch shared the Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts to ban anti-personnel landmines, and Human Rights Watch played a critical role in the establishment of the International Criminal Court and the ban of the use of cluster munitions. Roth recognized for real-time documentation of atrocities were important in order to generate immediate pressure to end those atrocities. That led to the creation of a special group of trained researchers who could provide a surge of capacity to the organization's regularly country researchers. Over the years, Roth has been an unrelenting irritant to authoritarian governments around the world, exposing human rights abuses with documented research reports that have become the group's specialty. Roth has also been an irritant to many Western democracies, holding them to account for their domestic and foreign policies that aid and abet human rights abuses. For those of us growing up and who came of age during Ken Roth's leadership of Human Rights Watch, he's played the role of a moral beacon and indeed a father-like figure on questions of human rights and international politics. He's led us forward and inspired many of us with his fearless passion for justice, his unwavering support for international law, his courage and compassion toward the victims of human rights violations and atrocity crimes. Even when I disagree with Ken Roth, like a father figure, his voice and words are still agitating my conscience, keeping me awake at night, forcing me to reevaluate my political and ethical position. The late Edward Said once observed that defending human rights matters, but it especially matters in those contexts where it's difficult to speak about them and to advocate for them. As you all know, this applies to the United States today at the level of the US government, in the mainstream media, and in establishment circles and at the senior administration levels of many universities and colleges. And this observation particularly applies to the case of the human rights of the Palestinian people, for which Ken Roth has been a tireless and principled advocate. And of course, for doing so, he's been attacked and defamed. But as I often tell human rights activists, when you're attacked by individuals, organizations, and governments for your support of human rights, wear these attacks as a badge of honor. It's a confirmation that your efforts matter, that you're making a difference, and that you're on the right ethical track. On a personal note, as I was reflecting on how I wanted to sort of introduce Ken today, it dawned upon me that because of Ken's hard work and his principled leadership of Human Rights Watch, objectively speaking, there are thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands of people or more, who today are not in prison, who are not subject to extreme interrogation tactics, and who are not facing torture, and who are walking around free, reunited with their families. Likewise, because of Ken's effort and those of Human Rights Watch, there's governments around the world that recoil when they hear the name Human Rights Watch or Ken Roth, and they have to think twice before they decide to violate and abuse human rights, knowing that Human Rights Watch is watching and is prepared to name and shame them in the court of public opinion. You know, Ken, when I think about your legacy, I can't think of a better legacy than this to leave behind. I think I speak for many people who thank you for your leadership, for your sacrifices, for your moral commitment over the years in defending human rights and exposing the repressive policies of abusive governments, including the US government. Allow me to conclude by quoting from Anthony Romeo, the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union, who observed that Ken Roth turned Human Rights Watch into a juggernaut for justice. And in the course of doing so, he's inspired a generation of human rights defenders to fight for a better world. Ken, it's a huge honor to have you here today. Congratulations on your new memoir. I can't wait to read it. As I told you before, I can't wait to use it in my classes. This is the official launch date of your book. It's a special privilege for us to have you here on the first day of the launch of your book, to be with us at Georgetown University. So ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, friends, comrades, colleagues, faculty, staff, students, and everyone else, please join me in welcoming to Georgetown University the great Kenneth Roth. Thanks.
Well, Nader, thank you for that very warm, if slightly over-the-top introduction. I'm very happy and indeed privileged to be here today. I mean, as Nader mentioned, today is the launch day for my book. I've been waiting for this for a long time. And we do have copies here, and I'm happy to sign anybody's book who wants to purchase this here. So, please do. The book, I mean, is memoirish, as Nader says, but it actually is really something else. It principally is an effort to take on the skeptics about the defense of human rights. And, there are lots of people who say, oh, you're for human rights. Isn't that nice? And they assume that, those who are defending human rights are, well-intentioned, but ineffectual. And what I try to do with this book is to show that the defense of human rights is really a process of playing hardball. That our job is to maximize pressure on governments that violate human rights, to assume that there is a certain rationality in the violation of human rights. This is a way for governments to stay in power, to get rid of the opposition, to accomplish what they want through illicit means. And our task is to change the cost-benefit analysis of repression, to increase the cost so that it is less beneficial to violate human rights. That's what we do. This is not about, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. This is about figuring out, what do governments care about, and how do we prevent them from getting that until they improve their human rights practices? And the book is filled with examples. I take on, some of the toughest cases. I take on China, Russia, Israel, Syria, Rwanda, and the United States. Now, the essence of the strategy is threefold. One, every government cares about its reputation, and every government wants to have a reputation of respecting human rights. Now, this is pure pretense a lot of the time. When Human Rights Watch and our colleagues can carefully investigate, document, and report on human rights violations, we shine a spotlight on the discrepancy between pretense and practice. And that is shameful. That is stigmatizing. It's delegitimizing. it portrays to the people of a government's country that the government is out for itself, not for the people. And so they fight tooth and nail to avoid that delegitimization. And that becomes a battle over facts, a battle of, what reality is. And that's a big part of what we do. Second, we take that information and we go to mostly democracies that claim to promote human rights in their foreign policies. And we'll approach them and say, will you help us put pressure on this target government by depriving it of something they want? And they always want something. They want arms sales, they want military aid, they want a beneficial trade package. Often they just want to be invited to a fancy summit so they can be photographed drinking champagne with legitimate leaders to tell the folks back home, I'm legitimate too. See, look who I'm with. So whatever it is, we figure that out and we try to prevent them from getting it. And then the third thing we do in extreme cases, we try to get people prosecuted. And that's still very much a work in progress, but nobody obviously wants to go to prison and nobody wants to face criminal charges either because it really constricts your life. So those are the tools we use. None of this is about, just lighting the candle and hoping for the best. And that's what I try to portray in the book, to show that, this is a process that governments really care about. If you look at how they respond, they know they're feeling the heat. And so we should understand that these are tools, strategies that we can use that do make a difference, that ideally improve respect for human rights, at minimum prevent things from getting worse. It's not a linear process, and that's one point I make in the book. It's not, I open up with the, the quote from Martin Luther King about how the, moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I say, that's not reality. And indeed, if you read the rest of that speech, he admits it's not reality. The quest for justice is an incessant struggle. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. The forces on the other side are always trying to get their way. And you've got to keep at it if you're defending human rights. It's not a process of quick wins, but you see the effect of the pressure. And if you can sustain that pressure, you do make a better world. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple aspects of Gaza, and then we'll have a conversation and then open it up for Q&A with all of you. One, I want to take on Trump's, ridiculous suggestion, really war crime suggestion, that the solution to Gaza is to get rid of the Palestinians, to depopulate Gaza and turn it into, the Riviera on the Mediterranean or whatever it is. And now, to put this in context, first, Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention makes it a war crime to forcibly expel the residents of occupied territory. So what Trump is proposing is a blatant war crime. To put this in political perspective, there traditionally have been three realistic options to resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. One, which I actually would be, perfectly happy to see, but recognize is not going to happen, is that, within what these days people call the one-state reality between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And they use that term because of the settlement project, because there just is, so little contiguous space left in the occupied West Bank to build an effective Palestinian state. That people say, okay, Israel's defeated the idea of a Palestinian state. Let's have equal rights for everybody within that one-state reality. Now, from my perspective, that'd be fine, but that's the last thing the Israeli government wants, because they would lose their Jewish majority. So that's not a viable option. The second option, which is what the Israeli government prefers, is the status quo, endless occupation, complaining that there's no partner in peace, and therefore we just have to keep going and going and going, and do that forever. And, the Israeli government got away with that for a while, but increasingly the status quo is understood properly as apartheid. And apartheid is a crime against humanity. So increasingly the world understands that endless occupation is a crime and cannot be countenanced. And indeed, the International Court of Justice said as much this past summer. So even though that's the preferred Israeli option, it is a declining option. The third option, which in many ways is the best, is a Palestinian state, living side by side with an Israeli state. But, Netanyahu has devoted his life to avoiding that. What Trump's proposal did is to suddenly surface a fourth option that has always been lingering in the background, but was just so beyond the pale that it was never actively discussed. And that was to solve the Palestinian problem by getting rid of the Palestinians, starting with Gaza, but you know what's next. And this was anathema because it was a massive war crime, because it would be a crime against humanity. Trump's proposal didn't legitimize it because just because somebody like Trump says they want it doesn't make it legal, but it brought it into the realm of policy discussion. And this has been the dream of the Israeli far right forever. So this is really, I think, the effect of Trump's proposal. Now, the good news is that the Arab states have all said no way. Egypt and Jordan, the supposed recipients of the Palestinians, don't want to be complicit in another Nakba, the 1948 forced expulsion of Palestinians. Jordan has its own demographic issues where it's probably already 60% Palestinian, and they worry about making that worse. They don't want to feed the Israeli myth that Jordan is the Palestinian state. Egypt has huge economic problems. They have an insurgency in North Sinai. They really don't want the population either. So they both said no, which was a courageous no because they both receive a lot of US military support. The Saudis and the Emiratis also said no, you want us to pay for reconstructing Gaza. We want a clear path for a Palestinian state, not a Palestinian state that's been emptied of Palestinians. I don't have a lot of faith in Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, but that's at least what he's saying now under pressure from the Saudi public. So I think, this Trump plan is dead in the water. The way forward, in my view, is in a sense to play to Trump's ego. He sees himself as the master deal maker. We've seen that he has clout over Netanyahu. It was really Trump's pressure that got Netanyahu to agree to this temporary ceasefire that is now, soon maybe coming to an end. But if Trump recognizes that his quest for a regional deal, Saudi normalizations with Israel, his Nobel Peace Prize, all depends on a Palestinian state. Trump is fickle enough, unprincipled enough, unmoored enough that he could, turn to Netanyahu and said, time's up. You got to accept this. And Netanyahu has always been able to say no to Democrats pushing for that because he had, the Christian evangelicals, he had the Republican Party on, he had AIPAC supporting him. But if Trump backs the Palestinian state, there's nobody to the right. Netanyahu is stuck. And so, can we get there? I don't know. But that is, I think, what we need to push is for Trump to recognize that for him to achieve his grand aspirations in deal-making, he needs to push for a Palestinian state, not for a depopulated Palestine. And that's the task before us. Now, the other, over-the-top thing Trump did is he renewed his sanctions against the ICC prosecutor, the International Criminal Court. You may recall from his last term, he imposed sanctions on the prior ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, and her deputy because of two things that she did. She opened two investigations that troubled Trump. One was the Afghan investigation, and he worried that that would implicate Bush-era torturers who committed some of the worst torture on Afghan territory, so therefore would be subject to the ICC's jurisdiction. And second, he worried that the Palestine investigation that she also opened up could implicate Israeli officials. Now we fast forward to the present. Karim Khan, the new ICC prosecutor, has said, don't worry about the Afghanistan investigation. I'm going to focus on the Taliban and Islamic State. We're not going to, get into the past. So in terms of US liability, that's over with on Afghanistan. But obviously with respect to the Palestine investigation, their worst fears have come to pass, and Netanyahu and Gallant have been charged for essentially the starvation strategy in Gaza, a massive war crime. And so Trump has come in and again impose sanctions on Karim Khan. Congress is threatening broader sanctions through legislation that so far has been stymied, but we'll have to see how that plays out. This is an outrageous assault on an independent institution of justice, of which the U.S. isn't even a member. But the idea that you try to change a prosecutor's decision by freezing his bank accounts and restricting his travel is the epitome of obstruction of justice. And one thing that I've warned Trump about, not in person, but through the media, is that if you read the Rome Statute, which is the founding treaty of the ICC, it creates a crime of what it calls interference in the administration of justice, what Americans refer to as obstruction of justice, and which it defines as intimidating or interfering with the work of an ICC official. And so these sanctions against Khan are smack in the middle of this obstruction of justice crime. Now, the same could have been said about what he did to Fatou Bensouda, and she kind of turned the other cheek and just put up with it. She had trouble getting money, her bank account was frozen, it was inconvenient, but she just kind of went on with her life and didn't accelerate the problem. Karim Khan, the current prosecutor, is a different character. And, he's political. I'm sure he's sitting there and trying to decide, what can I get away with? What should I do? But it wouldn't surprise me if he charged Trump with obstruction of justice. And even though the US government is not a member of the court, Khan would have jurisdiction over what Trump just did because Trump interfered with a ongoing, viable prosecution by the court. So this is a vulnerability. I don't know that it'll happen. If it does happen, it's not like, they'll put handcuffs on Trump tomorrow, but he can't pardon himself. He has no immunity. And suddenly his ability to travel to the 125 member states of the ICC would be limited because they would all be obliged to arrest him. And while nobody's going to want to arrest him, what they are going to do is to say, please, Mr. President, don't show up. This is how Putin lives today. He couldn't go to the BRICS summit in South Africa because it would have been obliged to arrest him. This is how Netanyahu operates. He can't go to Europe anymore. Does Trump want to live the rest of his presidency and beyond with those kind of travel restrictions? I don't know. I don't know if this is going to happen, but this is what we have to get the administration thinking about, particularly as they threaten to intensify these sanctions. So I will stop there and we'll continue the conversation.
Okay, thanks, Ken. The first question for you, how do you respond to the concerns of a cynic or skeptic about the importance of human rights? And the argument will go something like this. Notwithstanding all the important work that Human Rights Watch has done over the years, specifically on Israel-Palestine, at the end of the day, it did very little to stop Israel from its repression of the Palestinians, especially in the context of Gaza over the last 15 months. War crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and U.S. support for those policies, and maybe now extending those to the West Bank. So a cynic would say, look, great, but it doesn't seem like it made any difference. Netanyahu came to Washington, D.C. in July. He got 61 standing ovations before a joint session of Congress. He was here earlier this month as an honored guest of Donald Trump. There's a lot of people who look at this and they say, I don't see how this is making any difference in terms of stopping these policies. What would you say in response?
Okay, that's a good question. And let me begin by noting that the standards of international humanitarian law, which in essence are the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, are not, this wish list made up by the human rights movement. These were drafted by the militaries of the world to guide themselves because they recognized that the atrocities of World War II were intolerable and that they needed to move beyond this total war where attacking the civilian population was fair game to a more restricted war where you can shoot at the other side's combatants, but you've got to take various steps to spare civilians. And the Geneva Conventions are incredibly widely ratified. They are built into the military manuals of every Western government, including Israel. and most frankly abide by them. And even when they don't, they become the standard for criticizing. So, what was wrong with what Ukraine did in Mariupol, or what Russia did in Mariupol, or what, Russia did in Bucha? I mean, you look to the Geneva Conventions for that. And this sparked widespread outrage. I think it led to the breadth of the condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today in Darfur, why is everybody upset at what the rapid support forces are doing? Well, because they're slaughtering civilians, they're raping women. You can't do that under the Geneva Conventions. So these are still meaningful. I think they still correspond with people's moral framework for how you assess war. Now, nonetheless, some governments flout them because they feel that they can get away with it. Putin did this in Syria. Assad did it in Syria. Putin's doing it in Ukraine. Netanyahu did it in Geneva, in Gaza. And in Netanyahu's case, to come to your question, all he really cares about is whether U.S. support continues. And here, I really fault Biden, because Biden said all the right things. He said, stop starving civilians, stop bombing so indiscriminately, take greater care. And then he didn't follow that up with any consequences, with one exception. He did suspend delivery of the massive 2,000-pound bombs that were being used to decimate neighborhoods in Gaza. Apart from that, the gravy train kept flowing. And so Netanyahu calculated, well, the only relationship I really care about, which is with the US government, is fine. So, in those circumstances, yes, we didn't stop it. It did lead to Israel's, complete global condemnation. Israel's increasingly viewed as a pariah state because of its conduct in Gaza. So there have been consequences, but we were not, successful in stopping the war crimes that Israel committed repeatedly in Gaza. The ICC has stepped in now and tried to kind of begin to underscore these standards, which is an important step. But the fact that, to move to a different context, the fact that there are occasional murders in Washington doesn't mean that the criminal law against murder is worthless. And what you do, you need to bolster those standards. You need to enforce the law against violators. But you shouldn't get, I think, too discouraged just because certain individuals or governments flout the standards, when in fact most respect.
Right. And the fact that there's been such an attempt to attack the ICC, these stories that we're hearing about the attempts to intimidate the former ICC prosecutor by the Israeli government, all of those tell us that obviously these things matter, or else you wouldn't be exerting that much effort to try and delegitimize them.
Yeah, no, the Israeli government totally cares about this. That's why Trump reimposed sanctions, because he's trying to somehow reverse the charges against Netanyahu. That's why the Israeli government, sent the Mossad against Fatou Bensouda, threatening her, intimidating her husband. This is kind of blatant interference to try to prevent the war crime charges. In that case, they were mainly worried about the settlements. The Gaza war hadn't yet started. But the settlements themselves are war crimes. You're not allowed to move your population into occupied territory. So there has been vulnerability for a long, long time, and the Israelis were desperate to avoid underscoring the criminality of their occupation.
So let me now turn to sort of a bigger sort of historical, ethical question when it comes to human rights. And I guess the best way of phrasing it would be, how do we distinguish, or should we distinguish, between the violence of the colonizer versus the violence of the colonized? So if you think about it historically, there were slave revolts, there were, movements by indigenous populations to resist settler colonialism, and they were violent, and they were war crimes in many cases. But, when I talk to my students about this, and they say, okay, yes, under the law, I think everyone has to be treated equally. But structurally and historically and politically, when we think about those different forms of violence, there seems to be a significant moral difference between, let's say, the violence that the French imposed on Algeria for 132 years versus the violence of the Algerian National Liberation Front in resisting that struggle. So there is a tension here between these sort of different forms of violence. How do you, in your own mind, when you're teaching this topic, I'm sure it comes up in sort of, I guess, your courses. It certainly comes up in my classes, How do we make these distinctions, or should we make these distinctions? That's sort of the big question.
Okay, well, let me give you a post-1949 answer. Because, before the Geneva Conventions, where, these distinctions between, attacking combatants and attacking civilians were less clear, the answer might have been different. But since 1949, there is a clear answer, which is to say, in the colonizer-colonized distinction may speak to the legitimacy of using violence if directed against, the security forces of the colonizer, but they don't justify attacking civilians. So to put this in a more immediate context, what happened on October 7th, Hamas, in its imperfect way, representing a colonized people, doing it as a military dictatorship, but whatever. You could say, oh, it was just responding to the occupation, but it didn't just target Israeli soldiers. It deliberately targeted Israeli civilians, and that's a war crime. And you can't justify war crimes by saying, oh, my cause is good, because even if your cause is good, you have to fight it in a way consistent with the laws of war. And Hamas didn't do that. So, the killing, the abductions, the ongoing hostage holding, those are all war crimes that you cannot justify by virtue of the occupation. And so I resist people who say, oh, I'm just going to close my eyes to those war crimes because this is a just cause. That's not the way it works. And one reason is because everybody thinks they have a just cause. And if you suddenly said a just cause, allows war crimes, Putin would say, what do you mean? I have a just cause. I'm reconstituting the Soviet Union. I'm fighting NATO expansion, I mean, everybody has their reason. And suddenly you would have no humanitarian law, no protection for civilians, which is why those rules exist completely independently of the reason for which you're fighting.
So under international law, groups that are resisting foreign occupation, they're bound by what considerations? You can attack legitimate sort of security targets, but civilians are off limits. Is there anything else that you would sort of add to that equation?
Well, I mean, the legal answer here is if you look at the 49 Geneva Conventions, Common Article 3 is sort of the mini convention within that applies to rebel groups. So, only governments can ratify the Geneva Conventions, but everybody on their territory, including rebel groups, are bound by these basic standards. And they're completely common sense standards. In essence, you can't attack civilians, you can't torture civilians, you can't execute civilians, you can't, take civilians hostages. These are not radical standards, but the mere fact that you're, resisting whatever it is doesn't justify those war crimes.
Of course. So now we're at a university, and I want to sort of shift the conversation to the question of universities, questions of freedom of expression, outside lobbying groups, themes of anti-Semitism, et cetera. And you were embroiled in this scandal at Harvard University, actually right around the time that I had my own scandal going on at my previous institution. And I hope you talk about it in the book. I'm not sure if you do, but could you first remind the audience of what happened to you at Harvard in 2023, and then what the bigger lessons are that you've taken away from that particular scandal that matter for today in terms of our environment over debates on college campuses?
Yeah, I should say that everything that we're discussing today is in the book. So it's all there. What happened to me, for those who don't know, I announced in early 2022 that I would be stepping down from Human Rights Watch as of the end of August. And so my friends at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School called up and said, would you like a senior fellowship here while you write this book, which I announced I would be doing? And I thought about it for a little bit, and I said, yeah, sure, it sounds like a good thing to do. And it seemed like a pretty pro forma process. This was a human rights fellowship. I'm vaguely qualified for this. But there was one caveat, which none of us ever focused on, which is that the dean of the Kennedy School had to approve the fellowship. And I utterly ignored this, and actually contacted the dean over the summer to say, hey, I'm going to be there in September. You want to meet? And we set up a Zoom conversation and had a very pleasant half-hour conversation until at the end he asked me this weird question. He said, do you have any enemies? I said, well, yeah. And I said, I've been personally sanctioned by the Chinese government, by the Russian government. I said, the Saudis hate me, the Rwandans hate me, but I knew what he was driving at. So I said, and the Israeli government is not too fond of me, And 2 weeks later, my friends at the Kennedy School called up sheepishly and said, the dean vetoed your fellowship. So, I was surprised. And this, a friend of mine who is a journalist, Michael Massing, decided to write a piece about this. And he wrote a very in-depth piece about the various donors to the Kennedy School and their pro-Israel orientation. And he published it in The Nation in early January 2023. And that set off an explosion, with protests among the Harvard students and faculty and alums, huge media attention, including a whole bunch in the Boston Globe, where, kind of the hometown paper for the Harvard. And this, massive mobilization took 2 weeks until finally the dean called an emergency session of the Kennedy School faculty, and not a single faculty member supported his veto. And so he reversed course and offered me the fellowship. And which I still have to this day, because I couldn't really say no at that stage. But at the time, I said, very publicly, I could move Harvard because I have a certain media profile, and I was able to, mobilize a response. But most people who face retaliation for having views that are critical of Israel or pro-Palestinian don't have that capacity. And so the fact that they, reversed course for me says actually nothing about what most scholars and students would face. And so I actually asked Harvard University as a whole, as well as the Harvard Kennedy School, would you clarify and reaffirm the right of academic freedom in the context of discussion of Israel and Palestine? And they said no. They still haven't done it. Now, what Harvard did do just, a month and a half ago or so, is they adopted a new policy on anti-Semitism. And here they actually are making things worse, because they chose a very controversial definition of anti-Semitism. The one they've focused on is the one that Israel defenders always promote. And that's the definition issued by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA or IRA. And this is called a working definition. And the problem is that there are elements of it that are routinely used to tar critics of Israel with anti-Semitism. It says that, you're anti-Semitic if you're demonizing Israel, which is, of course, what human rights defenders do all the time for every country. That's how we operate. It says that you're, anti-Semitic if you're applying a double standard, which, conveniently changes the topic away from what Israel's doing to this bean counting exercise about, how many times did you criticize Israel versus, Tunisia or Vietnam or whatever, And it says that you're anti-Semitic if you accuse the Israeli government of being racist, which is what it is in its, in its apartheid in the occupied territories. So, these basic elements of the defense of human rights in the face of Israeli misconduct are easily tarred as anti-Semitic under the IRA definition. Now, there are two alternative definitions that Harvard could have embraced. One is called the Jerusalem Declaration. One is the Nexus document. And these are both superior in my view, because in addition to defining anti-Semitism in a very valid way, they include examples of what is not anti-Semitism, including legitimate criticism of Israeli human rights violations. And the IRA definition does not include those negative examples. And even though the IRA definition is billed as only a working definition, even though it has been so often misused, they keep it going. They haven't changed it. And Harvard, under pressure, obviously, went with the IRA definition. And my concern is, partly that this obviously stifles perfectly legitimate discussion of Israel-Palestine in Harvard and more broadly, but also that it actually cheapens the concept of anti-Semitism at a point when we need it. Because anti-Semitism is a real problem, and Jews around the world are confronting anti-Semitic statements and violence in increasing numbers, really, since October 7th. And if people come to equate charges of anti-Semitism with just a way to change the subject and to deflect attention from Israeli war crimes, that cheapens the concept of anti-Semitism. People will take it less seriously at a point when it's needed. Now, Netanyahu doesn't terribly care. I think he feels that all that matters is Israel. The Jews who who never moved to Israel, that's their problem. So like anti-Semitism in the world is actually not his concern. His concern is defending his, very violent approach to defending Israel. But, for those Jews, roughly half the world's population who don't live in Israel, they're stuck because this concept that they need right now is being cheapened by the defenders of the Israeli government.
So when you were defending yourself in the context of the Harvard scandal, you sort of blamed the role of pro-Israel donors, pressuring Harvard to withdraw the fellowship. And then you were attacked by the ADL, saying that, look, when you use the term pro-Israel donors, you're playing into an anti-Semitic stereotype here, Ken, and you got to be careful. And so a similar thing happened in my case back at the University of Denver. So when I started to think about this at a deeper level, there seems to be sort of a double sort of moral imperative that we have here. On the one hand, we don't want private interest groups to come and influence basic rights and freedoms of universities by using their economic resources. That's one thing that we want to push back against. But at the same time, we don't want to feed into anti-Semitic stereotypes by sort of using things and saying things about pro-Israel donors that could be that could further anti-Semitic stereotypes. So how do you and what advice do you have for us in terms of navigating that double moral bind?
Well, I mean, at the time, what I said is there are certain very big pro-Israel donors to the Kennedy School. And Michael Massing's article provides, details on that. I said, I have no direct evidence that they weighed in my case. I actually would have been surprised if they did because it's just a stupid fellowship, But, what the dean said is that he consulted with people who mattered to him. And he claimed it wasn't donors, but it pretty clearly was people who were worried about donor reaction. And the dean was just naive about this. I mean, he ended up having to resign and cause, a much bigger scandal by trying to censor me than he would have by just letting me show up and nobody would have cared. But the one point I made to Harvard, and I went back to my time at Human Rights Watch, I would occasionally run into a donor who would say, why are you saying such and such on this country? Why don't you say Y instead of Z? And, while I'm perfectly willing to have a conversation with anybody, one basic rule is we don't let donors to Human Rights Watch influence the outcome of our fact-finding and our policy positions, which are principled. And if they can't take that, they got to go find another organization. We only want donors who accept our principles. And if I could do that with, relatively small NGO, why can't Harvard, the richest university in the world, say that we do not want donors who seek to compromise academic freedom?
But why can't they? Answer your own question.
They wouldn't. They always feel that they're poor, and they just wouldn't take that step. And of course, it's only been worse since October 7th, where some donors have, openly flexed their muscles and really tried to encourage censorship. The universities, it's not just Harvard, have not been courageous in this respect. And they are all, bending over backwards to avoid, I think, really criticism by, the pro-Israel community. They're all worried at this point about congressional action. There's a serious possibility that Congress is going to impose a very substantial tax on endowment revenue, which is going to hurt every university that, lives in significant part from endowments. So they're all running scared, and they would rather, there's very little political cost to suppressing pro-Palestinian speech, and big cost if they're seen as allowing too much criticism of Israel. And that's sadly where we are right now. There are not a lot of principled, courageous universities.
And so how best to push back students, faculty, how do you push back against this in terms of trying to create a more level playing field?
Well, first of all, I think it's good we're having this conversation today. If there are efforts to censor or limit speakers, I think you go public with that. it's very hard to defend this. I think this idea of balanced panels is also wrong. I mean, I encourage people to invite, separately representatives of quite different points of view, make them answer questions that way. In other words, no just, propaganda speeches and go home. But, I think it'd be great to have a pro-Israel speaker here and let him answer questions. That's very informative. And similarly on the flip side, make somebody try to represent, Hamas. But I think that's instructive. But this idea of balancing, it never works. You can never get a balanced panel. But if there really are efforts to censor speakers who are just, representing a point of view, and that's what universities are supposed to be about, is to hear different points of view, I think you go public on that. You fight back.
Okay, so last question before I turn it over to the audience, not on the Middle East, just on where we are today politically as a country and as a world, given the election of Donald Trump and the presidency of the Trump-Elon Musk sort of dynamic duo. This is a very depressing moment. It seems to be a pivotal moment, a watershed moment, and not for the better. How best can we and should we sort of resist this turn to authoritarianism here in the United States, but also globally?
Well, first, I should say, I think it's a real risk. In other words, I mean, Trump is very deliberately following the autocrat's handbook, which is all about chipping away at the checks and balances on executive power. And so, why in one of his first days in office did he fire all the inspector generals? And that's not an accident. These are the independent voices within the agencies that call out wrongdoing. We're seeing, one important check, which is the media succumbing to him, for business reasons. This is the downside of having billionaires like Bezos own the Washington Post. I mean, I used to think, oh, great, he bailed out the Washington Post. This is an important institution. But Bezos, has huge business interests with the government. His cloud computing operations, his space plans, and he doesn't want to be on the wrong side of Trump. So suddenly he's censoring the Washington Post. And I used to publish in the Post all the time. I've not been able to publish recently. They just don't want to have, what I have to say. And, maybe that's just coincidence. I don't know. But I worry about this trend. You see something similar with the LA Times right now. You see something similar with Facebook. And obviously, Twitter X is gone off the deep end. Although I still am active there because it still is the most important social media forum there is. So, the judiciary already is, it's a significant check, but we don't know where the Supreme Court's going to be. It's obviously a very pro-Trump Supreme Court. Congress, the Democrats are still looking for their footing, and the Republicans, are all so fearful of primary challenges that they're prioritizing their personal political survival over doing the right thing for America. I think civil society still has a very important role to play. The universities have an important role to play. Trump is sensitive to criticism. And so I think we need to continue speaking out and hold him to account with these transgressions. It's not necessarily moving toward autocracy, but we have to be very aware that that is the direction it's heading right now.
Okay, great. Let's open the floor to some questions and comments, and the standard rules apply, sort of short comments and questions in those speeches, and we'll get to as many as we can before we have to wrap up. I think we have Fida.
Thank you so much. I don't know if you heard, but the organization Dawn is calling on the ICC to bring charges against the Biden and members of his administration for complicity in genocide. So I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, what Dawn has said is legally accurate, in the sense that because the U.S. was, actively arming and funding Israel as it was committing systematic war crimes in Gaza, the U.S. could be criminally liable, the senior officials. And, there's a precedent for that in the case of Taylor, the former Liberian president, who is serving, I think, a 50-year prison term in Britain for having armed a rebel group in next door Sierra Leone, the Revolutionary United Front, which was committing atrocities. And so that aiding and abetting of another force's atrocities is prosecutable. Now, what makes it complicated in the Gaza situation is that so far, only 2 Israeli officials have been charged, and really only for the starvation strategy. Nobody has been charged yet for the bombing. And if you look at, U.S. complicity, where Biden was actually quite outspoken and quite active in trying to push through the starvation strategy and oppose it, that's not really where his vulnerability is. If I were Kareem Khan, I would not charge Biden for complicity in starvation. And Khan has not charged anybody yet for the bombing. So I think that Dawn is kind of, a step ahead of itself right now. The next step really is to charge Israeli officials for the bombing. And I get Khan's conservatism. He's a good prosecutor. He wants to have the clear evidence. Where I would start is where he has hinted he would start, which is with the 2,000-pound bombs, because it's just impossible to justify their use in such a heavily populated area. Even given the Hamas tunnels, you don't just decimate whole neighborhoods. And a 2,000-pound bomb will basically kill anybody within the radius of 2 football fields. These are just not weapons for urban areas. And again, Biden is not likely to be culpable there because he suspended those weapons. If they get more fine-tuned in terms of going after some of the disproportionate attacks, the attacks on hospitals, the U.S. could be liable. But I think we're really not yet at the point of charging U.S. officials until sort of more work is done on Israeli officials, with the exception that I mentioned earlier, which is Trump could tomorrow be charged with obstruction of justice, because that's a simple crime to prove, and it's all there in his executive order.
Okay, I'll go to this side of the room. Yeah, go ahead.
All of your commentary and for joining us today. And thank you for hitting the nail on the head with the reminder that Trump is very much borrowing from the authoritarian playbook. And I think you're very uniquely qualified to offer commentary because you've dealt with the democratic backsliding in so many adjacent geographic contexts. Is there a particular case that we ought to be keeping in mind in terms of other authoritarian countries, other authoritarian contexts, similar democratic backsliding? Should we be paying attention to a particular other case study?
Well, maybe I should answer your question with a positive example, which is Poland. Because Poland, along with Viktor Orban's Hungary, were the 2 autocratic regimes in Europe. And they actually provided cover for each other as Brussels tried to impose sanctions on them for their democratic backsliding. And there was sufficient popular mobilization in Poland and a broad coalition, a very effective coalition against the PiS, the ruling party, that in the last election with a huge voter turnout, PiS lost. And the old, democratic center came back into power. And so Poland's now back in the democratic column. So you can win these things, but it does take, it takes real work. But otherwise, what Poland was doing was, they were focusing on the judiciary. They were really trying to undercut an independent judiciary and made quite a bit of headway. But there were, other elements of Poland, still a free press like Gazeta Wyborcza, very strong independent newspaper. There was a very active civil society. And there was, an effective political opposition that defragmented. They really came together, and that made the difference. Thanks.
Yeah, right here at the front. Just wait for the microphone.
Thank you for the talk. And could the UN invoke the Uniting for Peace resolution if Trump proceeds with the removal of Gazans from Gaza?
Well, if I heard you correctly, you asked, could the United Nations use Uniting for Peace to move forward in Gaza?
What is Uniting for Peace? Could you explain?
So Uniting for Peace is a doctrine that was adopted, I think, in the 50s to circumvent the veto in the Security Council. So when, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, US, Britain, France, then Soviet Union, now Russia, and China, each can block resolutions through their veto whenever they want. And when they're protecting themselves or their allies and the Security Council is stymied in an important situation, you can always theoretically move to the General Assembly where there is no veto and they can act. Now, people say, oh, but only the Security Council has coercive powers, but that's kind of a distinction without a difference because what do? They may create sanctions. They never send in the troops in an adversarial way. So most of what the Security Council does, the General Assembly can do as well. And people don't really use the term uniting for peace anymore, but we have looked to the General Assembly in situations where the veto has stymied action. And I'll give you an example. With at the height of the Syrian conflict, where Assad was just using chemical weapons and barrel bombs and torture and disappearances and breaking every rule to stay in power. We tried to get a referral from the UN Security Council to the International Criminal Court, and Russia and China vetoed it. And so we decided we're going to go to the General Assembly. Now, the General Assembly didn't have the power to provide jurisdiction to the ICC, but we let it do what it could do, and it created essentially a prosecutor without a court to collect evidence, analyze it, and make it available for national courts exercising universal jurisdiction. And this is now called the International Impartial Investigative Mechanism, the IIIM. And it's an institution in Geneva, which has been helping 120 some cases, including, I think the most famous one is in Koblenz in Germany, where a commander of a military facility who was involved with systematic torture was prosecuted and convicted, with help from the IIIM. So that's an example of how you can look to the General Assembly. And there's a lot the General Assembly can do. In the case of Russia, Ukraine, it expelled Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. It has repeatedly condemned Russia, including yesterday, despite US opposition. So even though people don't really talk about uniting for peace anymore, the idea of going to the General Assembly when you can't use the Security Council is a very viable one. And of course, there's also the Human Rights Council, which is actually easier to work with because it's fewer members. The General Assembly is everybody, 193. The Human Rights Council, I think, is 47 or something. So it's just more workable, and it can do pretty much everything as well. It set up a IIIM equivalent for Myanmar called the IIMM. So the idea behind your question is something that people do all the time now. It's not binding, but don't get caught up on that, because it's powerful. Nobody wants it. It can create mechanisms that investigate, that denounce, that report. It can't send in the troops, but the Security Council doesn't do that anyway. It can't impose sanctions, but the Security Council these days doesn't do that very often. So it just really doesn't matter that much. And it's more a matter of just getting them to act, and that action will be significant.
Let's take maybe 3 more questions. 1, 2, anyone on this side? 1, 2, and then 3, you're next. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much for your talk. I deeply admire your work and your courage to speaking up for people who are prosecuted by human rights. What advice would you give to students who are interested pursuing similar field? And what are some qualities you think they should have?
Okay. Well, let me give you an example from my career first, which was not typical because I'm a little bit older than you. And I knew from your age I wanted to do this work. And it was a kind of ridiculous thing to want because it was this tiny little field. I signed up for the one human rights course that was offered at my law school. They canceled it. So to this day, I've never taken a human rights course. I mean, I'm teaching 2 at Princeton, but I've never taken one. I went out into the world after I graduated. Human Rights Watch had 2 employees. So the idea of getting a job was like absurd. And I started, working as a lawyer, mainly as a prosecutor. And I volunteered nights and weekends doing human rights work. And that's the significant thing I take from my example, which is if you're really interested in this, find ways to start doing it. And it won't be your ideal job. It may be tangential, but just get going, and once you throw yourself into it, opportunities open up. What I would particularly, what we look for in researchers, we want people who, first of all, speak relevant languages. So if you don't have the language of the country or region you want to work in, go there. You're young. This is the time to travel. So, find a job, find an internship, find something that'll get you there and learn the language. And then, we want people who show the ability to, investigate, be analytic, write well, and speak well. And so, find chances, maybe as a freelance journalist, maybe just keeping a journal or a blog, find ways to show yourself capable of doing that. And it's just a matter of, you got to get started. And a lot of it may be starting on your own terms. But the more you do that, the more you become known, the more the doors will open for you.
And the other thing you can do is buy the book and read it for inspiration. That's on sale. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Frederick Merz from Germany said yesterday that Netanyahu is going to be able to visit Germany regardless of what the ICC says. Obviously, this foregoes Germany's duties to the International Criminal Court. My question is, how can we ask groups like Hamas to respect international humanitarian law when it never seems to apply to global North countries?
Yeah. No, I actually I wrote a piece, not specifically on Merz, because the only one yesterday, but I wrote a piece in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung on Germany's misuse of its Staatsräson, sort of its raison d'etre, its reason of state. And it's in Germans, but if you looked on either my LinkedIn account or I've got a personal webpage, kenroth.org, it's there in English. And what I argue is that Germany is drawing the wrong lessons from the Holocaust. It's understandable that the Holocaust, plays very prominently in German foreign policy today. But Germany seems to have interpreted that as defending Israel no matter what. And that corresponds with one group of people who feel that, why were the Jews persecuted in the Holocaust? It's because they were weak and didn't have a state, so they need to be strong. And, there's an element of truth to that, but human rights has no place in it. And I draw a very different lesson from the Holocaust. I say that the Jews were persecuted because human rights standards were weak, because Germany could get away with this. And that in order to prevent comparable atrocities, we need to bolster human rights standards. But you can't do that if there's a Palestine exception to those standards, because, it'll be a Palestine exception today and a Jewish exception tomorrow, and, it just keeps going on. The only way to have strong human rights standards is by upholding them for everybody. And so if Germany's Staatsräson is to make amends to the Jews and to try to protect Jews, which would be completely understandable, it's going about it the wrong way. It's actually making them more vulnerable by undermining human rights standards, by endorsing instead this view that Israel can do no wrong. And I think we need to, it's hard to say that in Germany because there's a lot of censorship. I was shocked that this fairly conservative newspaper, kind of the Wall Street Journal of Germany, published this, but they did. And I think we need to find ways to keep repeating that.
Yeah, last question right there. Just raise your hand.
Thank you for your comments and thoughts. My question is specifically in the case of an occupation, is it unambiguous that Israeli settlers are civilians in the context of the Geneva Convention? Thanks.
Yes, it is. And that's an important question because there's often a misunderstanding that just because the settler enterprise is a war crime, which it is, that violates Article 47, that doesn't change the character of the settlers. They're still civilians. They're still protected. Now, obviously, if a settler is armed and if they're, playing the role of an adjunct to the Israeli Defense Forces, that changes their character. Then they could be combatants. But your average settler who's just living in their house, the house may be illegal, but they're still civilians, non-combatants who are protected.
Okay, well, Ken, let me thank you for being here. Congrats on the book. I hope it has the type of resonance that you want it to have in terms of shaping our thinking about these issues. On a final note, I mentioned this to Ken, but I'll tell it to the audience. Every time I get an email with a recommendation on a possible speaker to be the keynote speaker for our convocation to get an honorary degree, I submit the name Kenneth Roth. If you feel that that's a good choice, I encourage you to talk to the powers that be at this university. And if there's enough people, I think, expressing that opinion, perhaps we can welcome you back again on that occasion to have you as another keynote speaker. Congratulations again on the book, and thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.